Welcome to the Proactive Caregiving Podcast. As a CPA with over 20 years as an industry accountant, Jessica stepped away from the corporate world to become a full-time caregiver for her mother. Having learned invaluable lessons along the way, she is now here to share those with you and to invite you to join her on this caregiver's journey. Here is your host, Jessica Cannon.
Hi everybody, this is Jessica. I am here today with a special guest. I am so excited about him because this is something that near and dear to my heart as a caregiver. You know, it's the hashtag caregiver support, but it goes above and beyond that. And I have spoken with enough caregivers recently that this is definitely something you will benefit from. My intent has been to share my experiences, also to give you a voice, you the caregiver, a voice, whether you know you're a caregiver or not. So without further ado, I want to welcome Larry Nisenson.
Good morning, Jessica.
Good morning. Thanks for coming on with me today. Larry, you're the Chief Commercial Officer for Genworth U.S. life insurance company. And the cool thing about this to me is that they have a program, a CareScout Caregiver Support Program that I wish I was aware of years ago before I came to my own point in life where I had to make that decision to step away from the corporate world. What is this CareScout program and what does it mean to you personally?
Well, thank you again for having me on, and it's an exciting program. It's born out of both a personal experience that I'm going to share with you. I know, as you and I have talked about, both being caregivers, we know it's deep in our heart, the struggles, the challenges, the responsibility of caregiving. And, you know, when you think about sort of that responsibility, you know, when you're going to be a parent, you sort of have 9 months to prepare to be a parent, and you read a lot of books and you talk to a lot of people, and there's this natural cycle, and you get excited and you learn as much as you can. You have time is on your side. The problem is that for most caregivers, it's an emergent issue. They're sailing along in their life and they receive the phone call, right? The phone call that says something has happened to your mother, your father, your loved one, an aunt, an uncle, and your world has just gone in a completely different direction. You're not prepared for it. You didn't expect, and you never did any of the pre-research. There's no what to expect when you're expecting for caregivers that you would bother reading, right? So the CareScout company, which has been around for well over 20 years, has been in the caregiving business, in the information business, since their inception. Genworth bought them around 10 years ago, and we bought them because we're a long-term care company. We sell long-term care insurance. They help. Our mission is to help the financing of aging, let people age on their terms. And CareScout aligned with our mission. And so we bought them and we introduced the service we're going to describe to our policyholders. And we sort of sat back and watched to see, did it work? Was it interesting? Did it help relieve the stress? And then about a year ago, we said, we're really comfortable that we are the experts in helping caregivers figure out how to navigate and provide the best care for their loved ones. And we created this new business out of it. And what they do in a nutshell, what their mission is they really want to provide care management support to these caregivers. They want to give them and their loved ones all of the best information, arm them with the best, the most current, the complete set of information so that they can make great choices for their loved ones. As we said, you don't really have a lot of time on your hands when you find out you're an emergent caregiver. Most people don't know where to turn, and we want CareScout to be the place that most people turn to.
That's perfect. And that's exactly why I wish I knew about this, but you said exactly that. You're not really planning for it. You don't see it coming. It just kind of happens. And in that moment when it happens, you're buried in doctor's appointments and the actual physical care of it. And everything, you're in this state of reaction, constant reaction, and you're just getting by day. And these things that happen, it's one day to the next, it's something new and something different, and you're emotionally involved in it. And so looking into, what do I do about it? How do I turn this around? Or is there anything I can do about it? It gets to be that emotional weight. And so for me, looking out and trying to find resources, it just didn't occur to me, because my focus was the care of my loved one, which is demanding in itself. And it was hard enough for me to make that mental switch that it's care for them instead of care about my needs at that point. But when it came to having to step away from a career, when I could have had a program provided that, like CareScout, that could have kept me working a little bit longer, because stepping away from that career is the first thing that comes to mind is, oh no, I'm losing my source of income. How am I going to maintain my own retirement benefits and my own source of income if I'm having to step away from that?
You have nailed so many of the issues just in that last 1 minute, right? There's this dual responsibility, right? What is my primary responsibility? Is it to earn money to provide for my family or my loved one, or is it to provide the care for my loved one? We know that there are 40 million unpaid caregivers in the United States, 40 million of them. There's only 350 million Americans. 11% of them currently are unpaid caregivers, and the expectation is over the next decade that number is going to go north of 50 to 60 to 70 million.
Right.
Other things that we know, caregivers on average, they spend up to $10,000 out of their own pocket on caregiving responsibilities, whether it's picking something up for a neighbor, bringing something to their parents, making modifications. So if you're faced with this dilemma, do I leave my job? It's not just, do I lose my source of income? Yes, that's a horrible decision to make, but especially knowing that you are going to be spending $10,000, $11,000 a year that you just sort of walked away from a job for. So it's unbelievably stressful, and add to that stress that as we said, most people are unprepared, and now they're being asked to make decisions for their loved ones, about their loved ones, that will impact their loved ones, and they aren't the experts in the room, Jessica.
Exactly.
Right?
And so for me, in my situation, I'm a CPA, and so stepping out of the corporate world and stepping into my mother's world, I had somewhat of a financial background, which is why the panic for me was much more heightened, thinking, I know the cost of this care. I know where we're headed, and I don't know how we're going to meet the demands, especially when much of this demand is unforeseen and you don't really know what to expect until you're in those moments of either crisis or sometimes, there were some situations, outpatient procedures, things that you know of, but there are other things that just kind of happen. And after a while, for me, every time those moments would just happen, yes, I thought about her health and well-being, but at the same time, I couldn't help but to think about the financial impact. Are we going to be okay? Is she going to have enough? And so for me, stepping into this from that financial aspect, I couldn't turn it off as an accountant. I was constantly analyzing and trying to trend her finances, but I don't believe others stepping into this situation would know, and those were those same questions as I attend caregiver support meetings and meet new caregivers and get that feeling of relatability to say, hey, I hear you, I see you, I'm going through the same thing, but we're also asking the same questions. How do I do this? How do I prepare for this? How do I prevent? How do I survive? So the financial part of it is something that, for me, the stress, it just throws on and adds on to everything else that's already chaotic.
the world of, not only that, the world of caregiving continues to change. I don't want to say evolve, because evolve makes it seem as if it's getting to a better state, and I wouldn't describe it as a better state. I'd say it's a changing state, right?
Right.
We look at increased, there's so many statistics that and trends that play into this. Look at increasing costs for caregiving, period. Whether you care for your loved ones at home, whether they're in a facility and you're a part-time caregiver, or they're in a full-time facility, the cost is growing exponentially. As a matter of fact, Genworth sponsors an industry study. We've been doing it for 16 years, called The Cost of Care. And the cost of care, which you can get on our website at genworth.com, looks at the cost at long-term care facilities, nursing homes, assisted living facilities, and then they look at what in-home costs are across every state in the country and by geography. So if you happen to be in Orange County, California, you have a different costing structure than somebody who lives outside of Pasadena. It looks at exactly those geographies. You plug in your zip code and it gives you the cost of care in your location. So your listeners can do that. And what they're going to see is a frightening thing, that the cost of care, regardless of which type of facility or at-home care, the escalation is going through the roof. The cost of bringing a worker in to help you, going through the roof. And at the same time, the U.S., sort of the demographics of the U.S. household, the makeup of the U.S. households are changing. There's less people in each house to provide support. The traditional view of a husband, a wife, and 2.5 kids are not the same demographics that we have today. As a matter of fact, if you look at the sort of the makeup of homes, you see that married couples have gone from what was 80% of the households in 1947 down to under 50% of the households in 2017, right?
That's amazing.
So you've got less people in a house being able to provide some of that care and offset some of that workload too. It's an incredible amount of stress, and add to it now the coronavirus and the current pandemic that we're in.
Of course.
Adding yet even more stress.
Yeah, and that was one of the things I noticed when I was trying to maintain and hang on to my career. I was finding caregivers either through services or private individuals, and the cost variation between their hourly rate versus looking at someone who was in-house and paid service, that especially when we approached the point of needing a 24/7 caregiver, and then it transitioned into the next decision of, do I have the in-house person? Do we look at facilities, or do we move her in with us? And I can only imagine, this was my mother, and it wasn't my mother-in-law. But I can only imagine families who have that. They may have dynamics that are just not conducive to living together. And so the options and weighing out the options and the differences, for me, it ended up being less expensive. Looking at it for my mother's perspective, it was less expensive for her to be in a facility than it was to have in-house caregivers on a 24/7 basis, in addition to maintaining her household and all the other items that are there. And so and what was hard for me is that at some point in time, I tried to make the promise and promise her that I would keep her in her home as long as possible. And then later that guilt set in because I had to break that promise because I couldn't provide the care for her. I mean, I'm an accountant, I'm not a nurse. I couldn't keep 24/7 care in there that wasn't going to cost more than her monthly income. And because we waited, and I think a lot of people end up doing this because we waited so long. Coming from the background, as a side note, my mother being the teacher, and she did learn and teach me the value of money and savings. And so she did have some savings, but not nearly enough when you approach the cost of aging, especially abnormal aging. And so the long-term care policies that she could have purchased in previous years, she didn't, because, oh, I don't need that. I don't need that. It's too soon. I can get that later. Well, now that we are hindsight in this situation that we're in, she could no longer qualify for long-term care because we didn't take advantage of the time to do it in advance and do it early on. And now we have situations where, thank God, she had retirement benefits and she has insurance, and that Medicare covers what it does. But that was the plan A. And they only carry so much. You still have to come up with a plan B for the differences, because 1 year alone for her, without insurance, 1 year she had a defibrillator, they call it regen or updated replacement. And within that same year, she also had to have her gallbladder removed. And looking at all the insurance forms and information we received after that, that 1 year alone, insurance was billed over $288,000.
Amazing.
And so seeing that 1 year to the next, it's like, how do I go from here? How do I keep us from going under?
It's a conundrum for sure. And you've touched on something that's also one of the biggest misconceptions that's out there about long-term care insurance, right? To your point, had your mother had a long-term care insurance policy in place, it would have picked up a substantial part, maybe not all, it depends on what she would have purchased, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it would have been a tremendous offset to those expenses. And there are really a bunch of misconceptions around the coverage of long-term care needs, right? The first is that my health care is going to pay for my health care coverage. And as you well know, it does as it relates to the health care cost.
Exactly.
It doesn't pay for things like modifications to your home. If you need a ramp, if you need somebody to come in and put grab bars up, if you need non-medical help, not picked up, but that's covered in long-term care insurance. But health insurance not. Most people say, well, Medicaid is going to pay or Medicare will pay. Yes, but you've got to spend through everything that your loved one has worked their entire life for. You don't have to spend it all, but you have to spend the vast majority, as I'm sure, Jessica, you know chapter and verse on. There's this idea where people say, well, I'm not going to need long-term care insurance. Well, we know that 70% of those that are age 65 and older, 70% of them are going to have a long-term care event and need help, whether in the home or in a facility. So yes, you could play the odds and say, I think I'm going to be in one of the, 3 of those 10, but it's likely that your listeners are going to need long-term care insurance. And you either help prepare for it or you rely on loved ones to take care of you, right? And there's no right answer, and we would never presume to tell people everybody should have a long-term care insurance policy. That's not my place to ever advise anybody of that. What I would say is it's a conversation that for sure you need to involve your loved ones in. I mentioned that I was a caregiver, and I received a phone call on a Tuesday afternoon from my mom who said, I have an older brother, and she called me, and then she called my brother and said, your father and I were driving down the road, and he was driving erratically, and I had him pull over, and we called the doctor, and the doctor said, meet me in the emergency room. Your father has a brain tumor, and he's going in for brain surgery tomorrow morning. That was the call.
Right.
Now, you get a call like that, your immediate reaction, right, is to go to, oh my God, is he going to be healthy? Is he going to survive? What does it all mean? And then you must go to the what or how could we possibly cover this? What does it mean? What do we do? How do we pay? Where do we go? Fortunately, my father had a long-term care policy. He had long-term care insurance. We didn't have a financial concern that I was worried about. Whether we would in the long run was a different question, but the immediacy of it, we weren't worried about. We got to concentrate on his care. I'm happy to report that he is 90. This was a decade ago.
Wow.
He was paralyzed from the neck down for almost 8 months. As they took this brain tumor out, it created some pressure on his brain, and he was paralyzed, and we had to deal with all of the things you'd imagine with. But he's fully recovered, 98%.
That's wonderful.
It's an amazing recovery, and it has a great story. But the truth is, we were unprepared on the care side, but thank God we were prepared on the financial end of it.
Right.
When all of this was said and done, we got to make decisions around the best health care we could get for him, the best rehab facility, the best physical therapy, without having to think about how in God's name are we going to pay for this.
And that's the difference for others, is that there's so many assumptions, and aside of the assumptions, we honestly this is something I didn't want to think about. I wanted to live my life and enjoy youth as much as possible. I didn't want to have the stress or even the worries of doom and gloom of what's ahead. And so I would put this out of my mind many times until something would happen. Just as you mentioned, there's always that event that comes around that makes you think, oh no, I should have this, I should have that, I could have done this sooner, I could have done that sooner. And those are those moments that it's too late. And so being in that reactive state, I was in it enough with my mother that I finally said, that's enough. We have to do this in a proactive way going forward. And now we have to pay attention to the things that we were either dismissing or break the assumptions that this is not going to happen to us because this wasn't in our history, our biological history. So we don't have to worry about this because it's not an issue, but that's not the case. And caregiving is definitely something that we don't plan on it. I mean, I planned on becoming a parent, planned on getting married and having kids and becoming a parent, but I didn't plan on becoming a caregiver in the sense that the differences between caring for my child as opposed to caring for my parent. It's just, we need to go about breaking the assumptions. And like you said, you can't tell people you have to have a long-term policy or you have to do this. But at some point in time, life starts to shift and make a difference to where these assumptions can no longer be avoided. We really have to face the facts. We need to approach this in a better mindset so that when things happen, we're not in this panic mode. We're not in this, for lack of a better phrase, oh crap, now what?
Yeah,
I've been there just enough.
You're spot on. And I will say again, in this changing world that we're living in, there's a hyper awareness now, even on the employer front. So most caregivers that I meet, that I speak to, and I do a fair amount of public speaking around caregiving and the financing of aging and what to do and how to help. Most people, when I ask, in an audience of 50, 60, 100 people, who here is a caregiver, very few hands go up.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I say, well, let me give you some examples of what I consider to be caregiving, right? And we start to talk about what some of those examples are, right? And I say, you're thinking, who's living with their parents full time? No, that's not what I'm talking about, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm saying to you, who stops by and drops a meal off on weekends? Who goes and mows the lawn for the neighbor? Who stops by their great aunt's house just to make sure they're doing okay, or helps pay the bills? Or who does what we would describe as good neighborly things for their folks or for neighbors in the middle of this pandemic?
Right.
How many times do I see people shopping for their loved ones, right? I happen to, not so much anymore because things have calmed down a little bit here in New Jersey, but I had said to my parents and my mother-in-law, I don't want you going to the store. And my wife and I, we did all of the food shopping for our parents and my two aunts.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that's the definition of caregiving. It isn't just what people think of as traditional caregiving.
Right.
It's that question. All of a sudden, 30, 40, 50% of the room raise their hand, and that's a much more realistic. The good news is these reluctant caregivers, reluctant to identify themselves as caregivers, they have more support than they are aware of. They just don't know where to get it. They don't know how to find it, right?
Exactly.
They
And
don't know what to do with it.
that's where I was. I didn't know where to find it, didn't know how to get it.
So what's really interesting to me is there's this, think about two ships that pass in the night and they just keep missing each other. And I say that because over the last year since we created this CareScout support, employer support service model, we met with 50, 60, maybe 100 companies across the country. It's a national program. Our network of nurses, social workers, and folks who center around aging, that network has over 100,000 healthcare professionals, general contractors, electricians, plumbers, all of whom work with us and who are in the aging business in their particular corner of the world. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
When we meet with companies nationally to talk about this service, it's fascinating. We share all of the statistics around caregiving and employees, the fact that there are these 40 million of them, the fact that the cost to employers in lost productivity is somewhere around $25 billion a year. That's what the U.S. company loses from employees who have either absenteeism, right? They're not showing up.
Mm-hmm.
They have the word that's used is zombieism, and that's those employees that show up but really are only there physically. They're,
right,
as I've done before when I was caregiving, right? I'm there, I'm functioning, but I'm really thinking about my father or my
mm-hmm.
father-in-law or my mother. I'm not really engaged. When you think about people who miss work because of unexpected outages, right? They have no choice but to take time off unexpectedly. You think, well, okay, what does all that mean? And by the way, about 70% of those employees that are caregivers report having missed work. So when we share this with employers, what they say to us is, we don't argue, we're not arguing the statistics. We're sure that that happens. But our employees haven't told us this is a need for them. So it's this two ships, the employees being one that need this service,
right,
but they're afraid. They didn't see the value of bringing it to their company because they don't think that they can solve it. It's the last statistic I'm going to throw at you around this, which is a fascinating one to me, is that about 55% of those people that we polled that were employee caregivers, they told their supervisor that they were caregivers also, right? They said, they shared with them that they were caregivers, and the employers didn't have anything to offer. So employees said, well, why am I going to bother telling anybody? They're not going to be able to help me. And the employee fear that an employer will think they're not committed to the job, that
mm-hmm.
they're going to be uninterested, that they're a clock watcher. All of these things sort of create this missed opportunity of employers that want to help their employees engage in their caregiving, yet they're unaware that employees are actually doing the caregiving, and therefore when they're getting benefits and bringing companies in to help them, they say, well, we don't really have any caregivers here, so no need to have this type of a service. So we've got to do a better job of creating awareness and understanding and getting those two constituents to talk more about what the need is in the workplace and how employers can help.
Absolutely. I was definitely one of those ships passing in the night. At the last corporate company I finally stepped away from, for me, I was exactly like you said. I was physically at the job, but I wasn't mentally or emotionally there because I was always worried about what needs my mother may have that I wasn't there to fulfill, or knowing an upcoming doctor's appointment was scheduled and how much time could I step away from a job and still get my job done without having to have excessive hours. I'm not going to go during the day to be with her at the doctor's office, so then I can go home and work into the evening and late evening, just to catch up. And so for me, the last and final corporate company, I finally had enough of it, because even though I made it known to them that I had caregiving responsibilities, they almost kind of treated it like it was a choice. I was choosing to caregive over the job. And so I didn't make it a point to make my situation more clear or known to them, because I actually had that fear of being let go and replaced with someone else that could do the job. And that fear was, we had, in that situation, we had summer interns that would come in, college interns, and trying to share that knowledge and expand and have more of that workforce coming in, that had the expanded knowledge prior to, like, graduation, for example. And so once the end of the summer came around and these interns would return back to their college routines, some of that work would come right back on my plate on top of my full-time schedule. And so there was this level of, if I make it known to you my work necessities and my personal necessities, would you be able to make the exception or not? And in this case, they were not as educated as I was seeking caregiver support, but they were not as educated as the need for the employee as a caregiver. And so had that been resolved, where they were able to provide a service that would help me stay at the job and not be stressed or not be mentally checked out in the job getting done, not making errors so the job takes twice as long to be done, I probably would have stayed in the corporate world a little bit longer, and definitely would have been more at ease and have more peace of mind knowing my mother was getting her needs, and it wasn't the struggle of, well, if I don't do it, then it's not going to get done. Or if I don't do it, then they won't know how to do it the way I would have done it. And it definitely is a point in time, where we have to make that switch, that cultural shift, that not only are we needing to care for our loved ones in different ways, because, for me, my perspective, I'm coming from a parent who is living with mixed dementia, but there are all sorts of caregivers out there with all sorts of needs that, without knowing the differences and without knowing the available programs, we're going to keep passing each other in the hallways and passing each other in the conference rooms, and everybody's going to stay quiet about it, and it's just not going to get any different or any better soon.
And as you know, caregiving is not only incredibly personal, it's also, each case is unique, right? So you look at folks that have dementia-related illnesses. Those manifest and take such different forms. Yes, you could say this group has Alzheimer's. That might be true. You might bucket people by that. But they're going through it differently. Their reactions are differently. Their loved ones' reactions are differently. And so many caregivers feel unbelievably isolated, and so they don't want to burden people at work with it. They don't want to burden their loved ones with it. They feel like they're the only ones that are kind of going through this situation. The great news with this CareScout service that we've introduced is that so it comes in three different ways. I'm going to really just describe the three of them quickly for your listeners and for you, so we've talked about it, but what is the thing that we keep talking about, right?
Right.
So we have three avenues that you get to utilize our service. The first is that we have a website called Elder Answers. It's got 50,000 pages of documents in it. It's an indexed library of information, right? And so you get 24/7 access to that, and you look at it and say, okay, I've got to do something as simple. It's not simple, but the idea is simple, to say, I've got to talk to my parents about taking their keys away. an unbelievably difficult conversation to have with your loved ones,
Oh, yes.
right? It's the feeling of freedom, the feeling of being further isolated for your loved ones. How do you have that conversation? How do you start it? What does it look like? We have a piece in there that talks through conversation starters and ways to overcome the objections. We've got this sort of library of documents. And that's really good for people who want general knowledge. But the acuteness of, I get the emergent call that says, oh my God, what do I do? The library isn't going to help you make those
Right.
decisions. What you do then, what's really the most powerful thing, is that we have an 800 number that we make available to the employees of companies that bring this service on. And they pick up a phone, they call an 800 number, and they get one of our clinicians. Every phone call is answered by a licensed social worker, a registered nurse, or another professional designated clinician. You explain to them exactly what's going on, whether it's my case, I needed to find a rehab facility for my father. He was, his medical care immediacy, the immediacy of it was taken care of, but I needed to find a facility that would work with him. You tell them exactly what's going on, whether you have insurance coverage, whether you don't, what the geography is, what some of your parameters are that you care about. And because this is what they do for a living, they know exactly the questions and advice to give you along this, what we call the intake form.
Mm-hmm.
They then spend, on average, about 9 or 10 hours doing research on your specific needs. This is customized research where they say, okay, this is what Jessica told me, this is what her mom needs, this is where her mom is. And we go to work. We find the facility if it's a facility. Let's say it's not. Let's say you need to bring in a home health care worker and you need 10 hours a week. We go ahead and we do all of the sourcing. We do the negotiating of price because we've been doing this for so long. We know what things should cost, and we have negotiated rates, and we can really bargain with some of the care companies and the durable medical equipment companies, et cetera, and get the best and most preferential pricing. We do all of this work for you. We then call you back and say, Jessica, here's the deal. We're going to send you out this report that's going to delineate everything for you, but take a deep breath. We've strung together the network of solutions for you. Here's what's available, by the way, because your mom was a teacher, and I'm making it up. Let's say she was a teacher in Houston, Texas. She has these resources available. Let's say your loved one was in the military. We do the research to see what the military benefits are that are available. What does the state and local government provide in terms of free services for their residents? We package all of this up. We string it together for you. We get on the phone and walk you through all of what we found and how we can help you. And then we give you unlimited access to the same care coordinator. So when you call back, you don't have to explain your story again. You get the same person. It's a team of two. So you have a primary and a backup, right?
That's
and then
fabulous.
They literally, what I hear from some of the employees that use the service is the amount of stress, the amount of relief that they then get to spend their time with their loved one, not figuring out how to care for their loved one. We already do that for them. And so that's really the most used service. And then the final service that we offer in sort of a pre-COVID and a post-COVID world. We're not doing this right now, and you'll understand why in a second. But there are many times that we get calls from clients who say, I don't know how to describe what's going on with my mom or my dad or my loved one. They look, they're off, right?
Yeah.
I don't know how to describe it. And so sometimes we'll jump on the phone with the loved one and we'll try and diagnose it there. And sometimes that works, but most often what we have to do is we have to put physical eyes on your loved one. So we will send out a registered nurse or a social worker or another clinician into your loved one's home, assisted living facility, nursing home, wherever she or he is. And they'll do an entire interview with them. It lasts between an hour and 2 hours. They'll go and they'll try and figure out exactly what's going on. And The moment they leave, they write up again another customized report, and they say, Jessica, you told us you thought your mom was slowing down. The great news is she's not any slower than another person of her age. However, while we were there, we noticed that there are two tripping hazards. You've got a rug that needs to really be removed, right? Or we noticed that her gait is a little bit off. It might be time for her to use a cane or to progress from a cane to a walker or something else. Because this is what we do for a living, we observe things that most new caregivers wouldn't notice.
That's perfect.
It's incredible. And so what I was saying is, in the world we're in today, most people don't want somebody in with their loved ones. And so we're doing some of this through telemedicine, right, where we're doing Zoom calls, but it's not quite as effective as when we can put physical eyes on a loved one. And here's the great thing. When we get a company that provides this for their employees, everything that I just described to you comes for free to the employee. There is no upcharge. There's no additional charge. There's no, well, you've called us 3 times, you can't call us again. It's entirely for free for the employees. So that's why it's so incredibly important that employees make their employers aware of this.
Definitely.
So that their employers know that they have to, and they should, and they want to provide a service like that.
This is a game changer. I mean, this is something that would change the American force of employees, the workforce. It's because everything that you described is what I struggled with on my own, trying to figure things out and not being able to know one thing to the next. I was trying to research online, go through the internet to find as much information as possible. But when I couldn't figure things out, or it was a little misleading or confusing, it just didn't make sense to me, we were going to every single doctor that I could think of to find some answer or find differences. And it was very time consuming. And so trying to balance going to the different doctor's offices and work. And even after I was no longer working and I was caring for her on a part-time and then eventually full-time basis, even then I was still stuck without a good amount of information and knowing specifically where to go or and when I would find that 1 or 2 nurses here and there that would give me a lot of information, I would hang on to that person and apologize over and over again. Sorry for another call. Sorry to keep bothering you. Because once I found someone who could give me the information I needed and could assess my mother in a quick enough time that I wouldn't be spending hours and days and emotionally stressing over it in the meantime, that's valuable time that I could have sat with her and just enjoyed time with her, or even figured other ways of spending time with her outside of the home. But this definitely, just hearing that, the description of the services provided makes me feel relaxed and at peace of mind knowing that's out there. So at that point in time, someday when I return to the workforce, or however things turn out, I'm more likely to look at an employer that has this kind of a benefit that doesn't. Because if it's not one parent, it may be a spouse or it may be a child. At this point, I don't know. And I know now to look at it more of in a proactive way, to anticipate.
It does change the dynamics. I'll tell you one more quick personal story. And we lost my father-in-law a few years ago.
I'm sorry.
And he was, first of all, he was about the nicest man I had ever met in my entire life. He lived a full, long life. And at the end, he went rather quickly. And we were fortunate that we had planned enough. So that last bit of time that my wife and her sisters and my mother-in-law had with their father, right, and me and my children with, my father-in-law and their grandfather, was not time spent worrying about how to give him the best care.
Mm.
We had made the arrangements. We knew what we were doing. We had a place that we could go that took care of all of this. So we got to really enjoy what little time we had left with him. And I think about for those that are scrambling and struggling and trying to figure out what the best care I can provide for my loved one, what they're missing is the richness of that time.
Definitely.
To be able to spend with their loved one, enjoying whatever the time is that they have left. And that's sort of the other, I often am accused of sounding like I'm a missionary on this great quest to bring caregiving. And I say to people that only because I've been through it,
Right.
and I've seen the good and I've heard the bad,
Mm-hmm.
that I want people to understand there is a better way, but that better way requires that employees that want their employers to potentially help, they've got to be willing, the employee has to be willing to put his hand up. And I get lots of questions from time to time of what's the right strategy? How does an employee start this conversation with their employer, right? How do I know I'm not going to get fired? How do I know, that I'm going to be taken seriously, that I'm not going to be thought of negatively?
Right.
And there are some really basic strategies, and it's not a difficult thing, but it does require what I would describe as a little bit of trust and courage, right? We know that caregivers are courageous by nature.
Mm-hmm.
They go into a situation that is unknown, that is emotional about their loved one, and they embrace it,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes reluctantly, sometimes unexpectedly, but they certainly don't shy away from embracing it. So we know that employees and caregivers have courage. They just have to have courage in the following way, right? They
Right.
have to go to their boss and be realistic. They have to say, here's my current situation. Don't oversell it. Don't over dramatize it, but be realistic in what they can do and what they can't do, right? If part of a job requires you to travel 2 weeks a month and you're a full-time caregiver, you have to be fair to your employer and say, I can't do that. How can we accommodate it else, in a different way?
Right.
You have to ask for help. You have to be willing to say to your friends, your loved ones, your coworkers, whomever, I need help with this. And Jessica, I'm gonna ask you the question, and I'm gonna sort of load it a little bit by saying, I never knew how much help was available until I asked, and the amount of outpouring of support and help was amazing. I hope that was your experience too.
And it's funny that you say that, because I was already thinking it, is that asking for help sometimes is the hardest thing to do. A spouse may not be the one to step forward to ask for help because they took vows, sickness and health. So they feel the obligation, the responsibility. This is my spouse. I'm going to take care of him. But when it comes to the parent and or a child, a special needs child, it's something that you're going to drown in your own. And I say you, me personally, I was drowning in my own worries and stress because I wasn't asking for help. And in some cases, I didn't know the question to ask. And so even when I finally came to the point of understanding which question to ask and who to ask, and I mean, it could be something as simple as, I'm not going to go to my mother's gastroenterologist and ask her about her cardiology questions, or vice versa, or go to the neurologist and point out issues that she may be having, that her eyes need to be checked or something. You know what I mean? It's just not knowing what question to ask and who to go to ask that question. And so then therefore, when I did my own research and trying to answer my own questions without having to ask and not feeling like I was out of control, because that's, as a caregiver, part of that is you want to feel like you are in control of the situation. It's not running away from you. And so whenever I did ask those questions, I would get the right answers and I would feel at peace. and I would know everything is going to be fine. But whenever I didn't ask the questions and I tried to figure things out on my own, then whenever I did make a decision, the guilt, just nagging guilt. Did I make the right choice? Could I have done this instead of that? Should I have done this instead of that? Did I do it too soon? Should I have waited? Those are the things that sometimes, quite honestly, keep me from sleeping at night. And until those questions are answered and you feel a certain amount of peace around them, it's hard to quiet the mind to focus on work. And even as I do things at home, whether I'm writing or working with other clients, that moment of focus is so important to get things done and move on to the next project. But even now, I find myself, I don't know what to ask. I don't know who to ask. I don't know if I should ask this. Because even though I grew up with the mother as a teacher who would drill it into you, there is no such thing as a stupid question. The only stupid question is the one that's not asked. I knew that, but I still struggled with coming forward and asking.
It's amazing that asking for help, you're exactly right, is such a hard thing for people to do, especially even more so at work. What we know about caregivers in general, right, is that they are incredibly dedicated. They're in most cases they're hold important jobs or important in the sense of their companies rely on them, and so to ask for help and when you're perceived as an expert in something else is really difficult. But they have to have the trust to do that. And here's 3 other quick strategies that I would share with you. First is, in addition to being realistic and asking for help, do your homework. Know what your employer offers. Do they have some sort of policy around caregiving? Do they allow, obviously they have to allow that family leave.
Right.
That's required, but do they have something in addition to that? If they do, how do they think about accrued time and vacation time and carryover time? So do your homework. Leave your emotions at the door. When you set up the meeting to talk through your needs, this has to be an unemotional conversation. And it's hard because there's nothing more emotional than our family's well-being. But when you're asking a company to make a decision, you have to recognize that the decision is almost never a singular, I want to help Jessica. It's around, I want to help Jessica and all of the other folks who are going through something similar. So to the extent you can separate your particular emotional tie to the issue and present what I would call just a business case for why they need to provide caregiving services or help caregivers out, it's more likely that you'll have a productive meeting and you'll start the ball rolling. And then the final thing that I would offer as a strategy for people who want to put their hand up and have this conversation is have an expected and suggested solution, right? Be prepared for when an employer says to you, what can I do to help?
Right.
Don't put it back on the employer to figure it out. Don't say, I don't know, let me think about it. Go in with what your ask is. You know, as most salespeople would tell you, you should always be willing to ask for the order. Know what it is that you want the outcome to be and share that with your employer. Try and build your case for it. Explain to them why and then ask them for what you need. And what we're hearing from employers is they are incredibly welcoming of these types of conversations, but they can't initiate them. They don't know who the caregivers are,
right.
So it would be hard to pick somebody. How would you know to pick Jessica or Larry, but not Tom or Frank?
They're right? Limited. They can't really ask some of those questions without crossing over. So we have to be the one in that respect. We have to be the ones that come forward and tell them, hey, I've got this issue. Can you help me? And you can help me by doing this.
That's exactly right.
This is great. This has been a wonderful time getting so much information. I've really enjoyed speaking with you, Larry. This is definitely something that, as I meet more and more caregivers and they come up with the same, like I said before, the same statements, the same questions, it's obviously a need that's out there that needs to be fulfilled. And CareScout seems to be the logic answer to all of this. I really appreciate you taking the time.
It was absolutely my pleasure. And your listeners can go to Genworth, GENWORTH.com if they want to look at that cost of care study or find out more around. We're thought leaders in the space around the financing of aging, so it's a good place to just start as you're thinking about this. Or they can also go to CareScout.com and learn more about both the CareScout services that we provide, and there's some thought leadership pieces on there as well around how to provide care and some of the difficulties and how we can help. So, Jessica, thank you so much for having me. It was really a pleasure to speak with you, and I'll look forward to chatting again at some point.
Absolutely. You're going to help so many caregivers. Thanks. Take care, Larry.
All right, thanks. Take care.
And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. And you can see why I was so excited about having Larry Nisenson on from Genworth today. I hope this gives you some food for thought as you navigate your caregiving journey and continue on with your caregiving responsibilities. These are the proactive measures it's time for us to start taking. Take care.
Thank you for joining us today. We really hope you've enjoyed this episode. To learn more about proactive caregiving and to hear other episodes of this podcast, please visit www.jessicalazelcannon.com. This podcast is produced by Cannon Light Media, LLC, www.cannonlightmedia.com. Music provided by Chris Paradise.